session of today. I'm Ha-Seok Chang. I'm very honored and pleased to be presenting the new BSHS John Pixton Prize. That's in my capacity as the Vice President of the Society, which I will no longer be after this. Before I get to the Pixton Prize, I'm also pleased to announce that we have a new prize. We're into this prize-giving mode, and we now have a new prize, which is going to be called the Ayrton Prize. It's for digital engagement in the history of science, technology, and medicine. And there will be a full announcement coming out soon to the members' email list and to Mersenne and other places from Jamie Stark. So please look out for that. We're presenting the Pixton and the Dingle Prizes today. Unfortunately, the time is relatively short, so let me try to be prompt. But 2 years ago, we started making internal noises in the society about how we ought to have a prize as a counterpart to the Dingle Prize, which you will hear about in just a bit. The Dingle Prize being for the popular book, we thought we should also have a prize for the scholarly book. And as you can imagine, we had a long period of discussion and argument about what this prize should be called. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but it was in the midst of that deadlock about the name that we got the sad news about the passing of John Pixton, and immediately everyone on the BSHS Council said, we must call this Pixton Prize, partly because of the sadness that we were experiencing, but also because John Pixton really was an epitome of a scholar who insisted on quality as well as scholarly interaction. So we all agreed that this would be called the John Pixton Prize. And I'd just like to take a moment to remember John, whose death really came as a great shock to many of us. And I think this photo actually captures the sense of John, this intense curiosity and questioning. He wouldn't let you off the hook very easily. He would always demand the point of what you were doing, as well as rigorous detail. What is the big picture? He would ask. So I'd like to just propose a very brief moment of silence in remembrance of John. Thank you. We had many good entries for the Pixton Prize. This is the inaugural prize. We expected great things, and our expectations were met. We have 3 books that were runners-up. 2 of the authors are here, John Agar and Eileen Fife, and the other is Gabriel Finkelstein. And we were just very grateful to have such good entries in this first prize judging. You can imagine announcing a big new shiny prize and having none worth giving the prize to. We certainly didn't have that issue. The winner, as you probably know by now, is Patently Contestable Electrical Technologies and Inventor Identities on Trial in Britain, by our 2 authors who will be telling you about their book in just a moment. As the cover of the book, a cover to match the very intriguing content. I'm not going to read you the whole prize commendation for this entry, but I'm going to show it to you. A superbly scholarly volume on electrical technologies. And it really was a great innovation, I think, for the authors to look through the course of patent litigations to tell the history of a very important set of technologies. And we judged it was a significant methodological contribution as well as a cracking good story. A novel and informative account of an important piece of our techno-scientific past with a clear pertinence to current issues surrounding intellectual property. So without much further ado, I'm going to present the two winning authors. The winner is the book. These are the people who happen to write it. Stathis Arapostathis is a lecturer at the University of Athens. After his DPhil at the University of Oxford, he spent many very varied and interesting postdoctoral years, including in Wales and in Leeds, where he was collaborating with this guy, Graham Goodey, Professor of History of Science and Technology at Leeds, as well as the head of the whole School of Philosophy, Religion, and History of Science. Many of you probably know his book, The Morals of Measurement, which was as well known as this one, but we didn't have a prize to give back then. So let me now present the actual award certificate. Now, they'll have to fight over it because there's only one certificate, but I'm very happy to report there are two checks. So would you please come up to the stage?
Well, thank you, everyone. I think thank you, Hasok in particular, and Stathis for being co-author. As a personal note, I should say that I've written various books before, but never won a prize. The only thing that got me the prize, I think, was working with Stathis. So thank you, Stathis, very much. Well, I learned from you. You can see here the cover of the book again. In case you wanted to see my increasingly rather soiled copy, it's not for sale. In case you wanted. Well, I will say a few general things about the book, its origins, the project it came from, then hand over to Stathis to talk much more about the kind of historiography and the content, and I'll wind up at the end with a few longer-term thoughts. The key thing I think to emphasize is that this did begin as a collective project, and collectivity is, I think, something to think about very much in the origins and the argument of the book. However, one might end up focusing on individuals as the bearers of merit for writing books or doing other scholarly things. There's always a collective behind it. And this project was what I think began it all. I'll say more about the people in a second, but owning and discerning invention, one of my more egregious puns, I suspect. Still got it funded anyway by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And Intellectual Property, Authority and Identity. British Science and Technology, 1880 to 1920. And Beres, are you here somewhere actually? The website is still there for you to see what we did. And this is part of the team. So there are three elements to the project, one of which was the history of electrical engineering and technology, which I worked on with Stathis. The second stream, Greg Raddick worked on with Beres Charnley. I guess you'd call it the history of agricultural botany. And thirdly, Christine MacLeod, working with John Hopwood Lewis, another PhD student on the history of aeronautics. And Greg is here, so I won't on this occasion embarrass him greatly about his role in the project. But I think Christine MacLeod owes us, we owe her an enormous amount. She was, I think, by far and away, the most outstanding scholar on the history of patents in the UK, and I think remains so. She's now retired from Bristol University. But it's very much her that was the inspiration for thinking about the project in certain ways. And her book, Inventing the Industrial Revolution, very much clarified the challenging understanding of a patent. The idea of an inventor originally only being someone who was licensed by a monarch to import, ne invenire, bring in. And somehow that mutates into an inventor. And the very idea that the solo inventor stays at the heart of law, emerging over several centuries from someone who merely imports, is at the very heart of our understanding about why we still linger over this notion of the first and true inventor, even though we now know invention is very much a collective activity, and certainly so in the 21st century. So we owe a lot to Christine and to Greg, and I want you to understand with Stathis how far this book came to being because this project made it possible. And of course, thank you to all of you, because you pay taxes, most of you anyway, to actually keep the HRC in business. Now, it's interesting to look back about how it all began. I mean, I think it began in 2006 when we first drafted the project. We had these rather overarching grand questions, which look possibly a little bit fluffy now, but this is where we started from, thinking about the ways in which in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there were some interesting things going on, both in new kinds of what Bruno Latour calls technoscience, and innovations in what we now call intellectual property, the management of rights over invention and creativity. And there seemed to be something interesting to be said about how they weren't just evolving coincidentally at the same time, but maybe there was some kind of interaction. We sought to find out what that might be and think about it in ways that maybe were particular to different disciplines. Okay. And then there was a question about pure and applied science. And these were terms I never felt happy with, and historians of science have often found them rather bizarrely arbitrary. It seemed that maybe there was something to be said about how the notion of applied science came to mean something which could be owned by a process of legalized property, such as the patent, whereas pure science always seemed to linger in the domain of that which belonged to the wider world. And this was not straightforward. It seemed to be worth interrogating and understanding how both the dichotomy of pure and applied science emerges again in this period, thinking what work does it do, whose purposes does it serve? And then thinking about that in relation to the way that ownership of knowledge is a controversial matter, and thinking about how far various practitioners of the technosciences went in appropriating or indeed not appropriating knowledge, how far that affected the way that they were seen as authorities with a sort of disinterested standing in their communities, and how far they could be trusted to speak on behalf of a discipline if they did have some financial interest, something which Lord Kelvin seemed to master almost uniquely, I think, in the 19th century. So that's where we began. Then, once we got into the project, it all changed. It became massively more complicated. I mean, tomorrow, Aileen is chairing a session on project management and so forth, and we'll talk about the ways in which what you thought you were going to study changes rather rapidly when you begin. And very quickly it became clear the notion of intellectual property was a lot more complicated if you looked at the history of it. Certainly it appeared to be an anachronism. Christine pointed out that nobody used the word intellectual property in the history of patents until the 1990s. When she wrote her book, it just wasn't a thing. It was maybe used by some American lawyers, but it seems to have been reified as something which had a history of several centuries. In fact, it was a very controversial term in Britain in the 19th century, the idea one could own ideas on philosophical grounds, legal grounds, economic grounds. But it was good for lawyers who wanted to exercise the powers of property law to extend into the world of science. What we found very much instead was there are all sorts of questions raised by this use of intellectual property. And we found I use it as a metaphor, not everyone likes that, but I think other metaphors such as monopoly are used, protection, social contract, the idea of the patent as a bargain between the inventor and the state is extremely powerful, understands how different countries can actually appreciate patents as either very much in favor of the inventor or of the state. Okay, as a social contract, it works in various ways. And Greg helpfully moved into this debate very adroitly, drawing out notions of IP. I mean, we used IP to avoid being clear what the P was about, like BP and BT, I guess, actually. And it seems to be very sensible to think about the ways that there are legalistic versions of ownership, which is rights to invention enshrined in copyright or trademark or patents, and also much broader notions of ownership over a domain of knowledge, which is known as IP broad. And that certainly features very strongly in the way that our project revealed differences between agricultural botany, aeronautics, and electrical engineering. I won't say much about that now, but just to give you a sense that this was a very much richer approach. And one thing particularly I want to emphasize, and I won't go through all these points, is that what really comes to the fore is that defending particular claims to ownership of knowledge is very much about the history of that invention. And it's really very striking how far, to understand patents, you understand them as accounts which claim a certain version of history for certain individuals doing certain things in relation to making new knowledge. And a large amount of our profession, I think, emerges, at least in the history of the physical sciences, actually, from the debating of rival accounts of invention. And I'll argue that later on if need be in questions. The First World War also matters, but you've probably heard enough of that already this last year. Now, when we got the project funding, we already had in mind two big publications. And in many ways, the defining publication of the project is the first one there. It's a large part of a special issue of Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Part A, from June 2013. Christine McLeod and Greg edited that together, and there are lots of pieces, 10 pieces, most of which are co-written, as an example of the very collaborative nature of the project. And then this book, Patently Contestable, again, I'm afraid, one of my worst puns. Though the subtitle, I think, came largely from Stathis with a bit of tweaking by MIT Press, so thank you again for that. And Stathis was so busy and so active in the project, even managed to produce from our end of project conference this volume with Graham Dudfield, who some of you may know is a geographer who specialises in IP rights on a global scale. The book called Knowledge Management and Intellectual Property. So we were quite busy. But then, as I say, it's all about collectivity, working together with people from different countries. One gets a much richer sense of how one country, Britain's patent laws can be understood. And it was very much a way, I suppose, of bringing together the history of law and the history of science. This is where it was most intriguing for me. I learned a lot from working with lawyers on the project. And Joseph Chamberlain, who may be known for other reasons to you, a slightly eccentric practitioner of imperial history, or imperial management, but he was also the author, largely, in his Birmingham years, of a very important revision to UK patent law. And in the very opening pages of the book, those of you who read it, have you done your homework? You'll know already, of course, that he's there laying out the ambitions of his new patent law, which was meant to make the getting of a patent almost as easy as it already was in the USA, which had become the model of a patenting nation during the spectacularly effective displays at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. At least that's the argument of the book. And he says out there, and I won't read it out to you, but it's very clear that the idea is of patent law must give adequate protection to the inventor, but not create an undue monopoly, a moral principle built into the very heart of patent law. The idea is to make it not too expensive to obtain patents. So not to add to the class of any inventor. It's clear that patent law had previously favoured capitalists or those with access to large amounts of capital. There should be real protection, not merely there to help line lawyers' pockets. And also, when litigation happened, it was to be cheap and efficient. Now, what we discovered in the course of the project is that litigation was made extraordinarily easy by this law, because actually the Patent Office was not given any rights of inspection. It was only the High Court where you would actually have patent claims resolved. So later on, 1905, the level of litigation was so extraordinarily great and embarrassingly so that the Patent Office in London agreed it would start inspection proceedings to make sure that most conflicts of patents were dealt with before patents were actually awarded. Okay, and that's a big change going following the American model. And you can see this actually when you look at Oliver Lodge's work. Oliver Lodge is one of my favourite characters, actually, a multifaceted individual. Managed to deal with a very long-term battle with a game of Marconi about who could be deemed the inventor of wireless, that is, of radio. He had no litigation. This was a spectacular achievement, because litigation had been the bane of many of his colleagues' lives. And he's written to by John Wolfe Barry, the telegraph magnate, with many congratulations that he could actually get a deal with Marconi for recognition jointly without going to litigation. So what we found writing the book more generally is that there was a sense of wanting to explain why there was so much litigation, particularly over inventions such as the telephone, radio, and the electric lamp, things which are very much part of our everyday life. But not everything. Okay, the microphone, invented at the same time, nothing by way of patenting or indeed litigation. And David Hughes, of course, born in Wales, we think, or at least to a Welsh family, actually announced the invention of the microphone in a paper read by Thomas Henry Huxley to the Royal Society in 1878, and actively disclaimed any wish to get a patent. More on that in a while. But those who did take out patents, what was at stake, actually? And it's very clear that we enter the realms of capitalism, actually. Patents were forms of capital, also forms of credit. I mean, I owe much to Stathis in the understanding of this particular point, okay? And also to Stathis the really sharp sense in which the patent agents who were in charge of the process of formulating ideas into legal documents and defending them in various ways. These are critical people. They're not visible in many hagiographies of engineers, but they make most of the running. These are the people that actually write patent documents, not the inventors themselves, though their name will be at the bottom. So we can come into this thinking about how the notion of moral economy can actually be used to explore how far inventions were under some kind of constraint in terms of how one used the potential monopoly powers of patents, licensed or otherwise, by patent agents wanting to encourage maximum revenue from patents. And we find ourselves looking very much at the role of judges, okay, deciding how each particular rival account of invention should be weighed up and which should be accorded the true story of invention and thereby patents awarded. I mean, who would have thought the High Court judges would end up being historiographers of technology? But that's what they were. Okay, that's where we get much of our history of technology from, I argue. And this is just, in case, again, you've not seen it yet, the outline of the book. We do some introductory material. That's online, I think, free to access. Thinking about the spaces of invention, the workshop, the court of law, thinking about the ways in which inventions had to be protected very much in British law from any prying eyes before patents, because once an invention was in the public domain in Britain, it was not patentable. It was open to the commons. The exact opposite of the USA, where displaying an invention was your way of claiming a legal right to be recognized as owner, which caused much confusion for Bell and Edison. Looking particularly then next at the different legal agents, the experts, judges, and the witnesses. And we go through the 4 technologies: telephones, then wireless, dynamos, and the electric lamp. And then drawing out some conclusions which link to the larger US story. At this point, I'll hand over to Stathis, who can explain the issues of historiography. So,
thank you very much, Graham, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I would like to thank the British Society for the History of Science for this award, and also for me it's a special moment because John Pixton was one of the scholars that one of the very first scholars that I heard and followed his work, but also that I heard when I arrived in Oxford in Robert Fox seminar. So it's a special moment for me, and also it's a special moment because of the hard times that we have in Greece. So all your moral support is very important for us scholars that work in Greece and try to, let's say, make some decent work in deconstructing practically university in Greece. But we can talk tomorrow in Eileen's roundtable session about this. For me, it's important. It's a special moment because my debts to Graham are many, because he gave me the opportunity to be matured through this project and move very smoothly from the PhD, let's say, level to the postdoctoral and then to teaching level. And also it was very important because I met Greg, Christine, Beris, and John, and they contributed to my maturity, particularly Greg and Christine, and I am and will be always grateful to them, the 3 leaders of this project. So in terms of the historiographical approach, as Graham said, we try to focus on law and science, but not as 2 parallel practices, to bring those together. In a way, we try to supplement existing historiography of technology that look at patents mainly from business history point of view, or to overcome the drawbacks of legal history that look at the evolution of law without looking at the interaction, the co-production of science, technology, and law. In that way, we started along the way, that's not our historiographic from point of view from right at the start of the project, but we start changing the way that we look at the law. And here Mario Biagioli, when he read our stuff, he said that how we approach law is like law as technology, law as a system, that as a machine that is composed by different components, but also that creates reality, creates technological environment. So that's how we aimed to approach this interrelation of law and science. As Graham said, we approach intellectual property, more specifically patents, as forms of credit. And this is an idea that we borrowed from Mario's work on Galileo. Patents as credit, financial credit, money, through monopolies, but also patents as credit as rewards. So social and cultural capital. So patents were played both in the economic level, but also in the symbolic level. And in that way, for us, invention was not only the physical machine, the physical entity. It was how invention was conceived by the inventor, by different experts, patent agents, engineers, consultants, and was configured the meaning on the paper, on the specification, and then moved on to different locales, from the, let's say, desk of a patent agent to the law court, to the patent office, and then to the law court. So we followed the actors and the meanings that they, the meanings of the inventions all the way in different locales. So for us, the battles, because the book was focused on the battle was not only about the ownership, it was about it, but not only about it, it was about meanings, the identity of the technologies, the identity of innovations, and also the identity of the inventors. So law courts, an important side of innovation in our approach, and the law courts we approach as an open, the open theater of contestation. And this was facilitated because, as Graham said, because of the patent law, the specificities of the patent, the UK patent law, that enforced an examination process just after 1905. So courts became the important, let's say, venues for the technology transfer, for the technology evaluation. So in that setting, we tried to see what were the experts, how they contribute in the configuration of meanings, and also how they build their arguments, in what way legal experts organize specific strategies, and the role of experts, witnesses there, and at the final end, how judges made decisions. And that was an important point for us, how judges make their mind. Because we wanted to understand this decision-making process not as, let's say, a decision, a resolution of a rational, let's say, actor, but as a process that came at the end of a battle. So the performativity of experts, of expert witnesses, of lawyers played an important role in the making of this decision of the British judges. Those chaps here, upper middle class people, educated mainly in Oxbridge, studying law, but there were exceptions, like at the left corner, the Richard Webster, who had studied natural science and then moved to the bench. Important here in this decision-making process was the issue of trust. The issue of trust was very critical for those judges. Whom to trust became an important issue for them, but also for us as an analyst, as historians. So we found out that there were two different approaches. The one expressed by Richard Webster, who was looking for honest experts. So he was looking for the qualities of expert witnesses. And on the other hand, we had Moulton, who emphasized on the argument, on the legal argument and the proper legal deduction during the court case. So important for us was the performativity of factors, the meanings that were configured along this during the court cases. For example, here in the Bell, in the telephone, Edison Bell telephone patent disputes in the UK, it was all about the meaning of Edison's patent transmitter. And this became even more dramatic when the resolution of the judge, someone who did not have the, let's say, technical expertise in order to impose the meaning, through this process, the patents became a master patent. That means that covered a lot, or at least the principles, the main principles of the invention. And this was considered as important, both in terms of the business strategy of the companies, but also because it became, let's say, an issue of battle in the popular press, in the journals and the magazine, attacking greedy, let's say, the editors of the journals, attack greedy business strategies by greedy businessmen who wanted to enforce master patents, and also editorials criticized, as this one, editorials criticized expert witnesses that they did not act as assistants of the judges, of someone who did not have the technical, let's say, knowledge to understand innovation, but they acted as, let's say, partisans of the interests of specific industrial concerns. And the same, if we look to other patent disputes, emblematic patent disputes like the incandescent patent dispute, where Swan, who had demonstrated incandescent lighting in Newcastle, forced the Edison company, who first patented in Britain, to merge in an Edison Swan company. When they start chasing infringers, and when they started patent battles, and when the opponents start organize their strategy, they dragged Swan in the court. And there, because for the opponents of the Edison Swan company, the important issue was the workability of Edison's inventions and Edison patent. And there, Swan, who had spent 30 years of experimentation about carbonization process, and if there was an expert at that moment in Britain, it was only Swan. When they pressed by the legal team of the opponents, and in order to secure the interests of the Edison company, the Edison Swan company, he said that, look, don't talk to me, don't speak to me about filaments. I'm not an authority on filaments. The man who had spent 30 years of experimentation in Newcastle on carbonization processes. So it was such an irritating case that for the judge delegate practically the decision to an external expert. He called George Gabriel Stokes, Lancashire professor in Cambridge, and said, look, I'm completely confused, get me a report and really help me, assist me, as an external neutral, let's say, expert, and it was based on this, on Gabriel Stokes, on Stokes' report, his decision. A decision that was overturned by his colleagues at the appeal level and triggered a huge reaction, this overturning of, in the Court of Appeal, in the popular press and the semi-technical press like the Electrician and the Telegraphic Journal and Electrical Review that accused the judges that they were playing the game of Edison, that Edison name was a fetish, and they were trapped by Edison's symbolic capital and huge, let's say, prestige, instead of looking at facts, instead of looking at the meaning and the issues of workability of filaments. So, in more general terms, in terms of how the patent regimes and inventor's identity constructed, co-produced at the period of our study, we can say, summarizing some of the points of our book, that there was an individual styles and priorities. You have people like Lowe's that followed a different strategy from Marconi. Indeed, the electrical industry was full of patents, and more importantly, full of patent disputation. Also, patenting was a multi-site and multi-stage process, from patent office, from patent agencies to patent office, and then to courts. So you have to look at how a patent was constructed as a master patent, and there the performativity of factors was very important. Also very important in our approach is the understanding of there was a moral economy inscribed in the legal system and in the patent law, saying that, look, we need to secure monopolies in order to innovate, but there were other different alternative ways of innovation emerged as fragmented discourses, both in journals and also in letters that inventors wrote at that moment. And I pass to Graham for the last part of the book.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's great. Thank you, Stathis. Just to finish off then, just 3 more slides. I thought it would be worth just bringing home a little bit more about the Welsh case, as we are in Wales. Particularly the case of non-patenting. I mean, what's obvious to us from this case is that the names of Edison and Bell come to be very, very well known because they are the subject of so much litigation, largely by the companies launching litigation. Those inventors who did not take out patents, or who did take out patents but didn't litigate aggressively, are far less well known now. It is really in the process of defending a contested patent that very, very strong claims are made about one person alone doing an invention. Okay, that is how the individualism of invention gets reified by the patent contest system. By contrast, you see very different kinds of processes which are less visible, less documented. But for example, one nice example, which I've hinted at already, let me show you more now, a nice collaboration between 2 Welsh-born Londoners, both from North Wales, David Hughes, who came from the same hometown as Owen Glendower, and William Priest, born in Carnarvon, both from North Wales. Hughes made enough money out of his telegraph patents to never have to worry again about owning inventions, unlike Bell and Edison. And just, as I said earlier, gave the microphone, and also the principle of the audiometer, my next project, to the Royal Society. And says publicly how much William Priest, as the chief electrician of the post office, has been there, helping him all the way through developing his ideas. And says, literally, I do not intend to take out a patent, as the facts I've mentioned belong more to the domain of discovery than invention. No doubt inventors will ere long improve on the form of materials employed. I have already my reward in being allowed to submit my researches to the Royal Society. So you see a very different discourse, far away from that of patent monopolies that we wrote about in the book. There's much more to be said. There's more been done already. We followed up various kinds of projects all supported in the UK, at least by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, working with museums, with other scholars, looking increasingly at global patent cultures, the enormous links between patents and empire, seeing how mostly it's imperialism and world trade that brings patents to countries that didn't otherwise have them. Patents emerging very much in medicine in the UK in the 20th century, and in a very complex ways linking to the issues of disability in both hearing aids and prostheses. And of course, Stathis has been working very much now on patent history in Greece, and particularly recently actually working up a project on IP in agriculture. So let me then wind up by listing just a small number of those organisations we should thank. It wasn't just a team project, it was actually a vast number of sponsors and people who hosted conferences and who actually we invited and came along to our conferences to give us really great feedback. So thank you to them, particularly, I should say, of course, at the end to the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And thank you for listening.
We started a few minutes late, so if there are any burning questions for these two authors, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll move on to the Dingle Prize. Well, if not, I do hope you catch them at the reception later today and or in the next day and a half. So thank you again. Congratulations. I'm now going to hand over to Jamie Stark, who's the chair of the BSHS Outreach and Education Committee, who will present the Dingle Prize.
Jamie, you need to add a little bit of time. You get away with it. Yeah. Thank you very much, Hassok, and thank you. I think we've been joined by a few more people. Hopefully we will have a little bit of time at the end for some questions, but thank you all very much for sticking around for this Dingle presentation part of the session. As Hassok mentioned, I'm here really in my capacity as chair of the Outreach and Education Committee of the BSHS, and it's traditionally been the job of the OEC to oversee the administration of the Dingle Prize, and it's been my absolute pleasure to do that on this occasion for the second time as part of my tenure in that post. The Dingle Prize was established by the Society in 1997 to recognise excellence in communicating the history of science, technology and medicine to wider audiences beyond academia, recognising the contribution as well of Herbert Dingle, a founder member of the BSHS and a man who really embodied a highly interdisciplinary approach to academic work and to communicating his own research to public debates on science, particularly in the area of physics. On this occasion, I was very privileged to hand over the duties of the judging process to four very distinguished colleagues, Patricia Fowler, Helen Bynum, Vanessa Heggie and Gowan Dawson, Gowan who chaired the judging panel. And I'm really here just to express my gratitude on behalf of the Society to them for conducting their job so efficiently. We set a very tight deadline for turning around a result for the Dingle this year, and I'm pleased to say that they met it with time to spare. So can you please just acknowledge their contribution to this year's prize. And I'd like to now hand over to Gowan, who, as chair of the judging panel, is perhaps better placed than anyone to give this year's Dingle commendation.
Like Graham, I'm going to face Martin. It is the only one, I think, at the conference. If you want to have a look, do take your chance. As soon as I accepted Jamie's invitation to chair the judging panel for the Dingle Prize, every day that I went into my university department, my pigeonhole was absolutely jam-packed with books, and these range from august academic tomes issued by university presses to popular potboilers coming out with trade publishers. The Dingle Prize really does get entries from across the field. And from this very large range of books, I at first thought that this was going to be an enormously daunting and difficult task. Actually, it proved, and one of the reasons why we could meet your tight deadlines, was that it proved to be, firstly, a very enjoyable task, but actually not all that difficult. There were 2 titles published in the last 2 years. So the Dingle Prize is for books published in 2013 and 2014. And there were a number of very, very good books, but 2 that really stood out. Firstly, there was James Secord's Visions of Science, Books and Readers at the Dawn of the Victorian Age, which came out with Oxford University Press, a thrillingly lucid account of the new approaches to writing and reading science inaugurated by the industrial print culture of early 19th century Britain. As many of you will know who've read this, it's an absolutely brilliant book, and I think in any other year pretty much it would have been the winner. But this year it was up against very stiff competition, and in fact there was a clear and emphatic winner coming from all of our judges. Unlike in an Oscars ceremony, there's no suspense here because you can see the book that is up there. It is, of course, Martin Rudwick's Earth's Deep History, How It Was Discovered and Why It Matters. And before I hand over to Martin, who's going to tell us more about the book, I want to just kind of emphasize 3 elements of the book that I think made it such an emphatic but also a deserving winner of the Dingle Prize, which, unlike its younger sibling, the Pickstone Prize, requires books to be accessible to a non-specialist audience. So it's a kind of prize that is explicitly about history of science, but history of science done well, but that is accessible more broadly than just to the community of scholars. And I think there were 3 particular ways in which Earth's Deep History kind of did this. First of all is its very broad synoptic range, from Bishop Ussher in the 17th century, dating the week of primal creation to 4004 BC, to the most recent radiometric measurements of the Earth's age in several billions of years. The book, however, isn't really about the calculation of such numbers, whether big or small, and instead is more concerned with exactly how the Earth's deep history has been pieced together and reconstructed. In so doing, it provides, I think, big picture history at its very biggest, with geological deep time being the story of everything on Earth over unimaginable eons of time. It's also, though, big picture history at its very best, with the expertise and erudition on display never faltering for a moment across the 5 centuries and the broad international range under consideration. Secondly, the clarity and precision of the writing, the organisation and the presentation of the book. It's a beautifully written book, but thanks partly to University of Chicago Press, it's a beautifully presented book as well, with the reader led authoritatively and engagingly through the different eras of the reconstruction of deep time. Yet for all its accessibility, Earth's Deep History is not a book without opinions. In fact, the narrative is often quite trenchant, with Martin taking aim at both the fundamentalist atheists, for whom science must always be vanquishing religion, like St. George and the Dragon, as well as the modern young Earth creationists who, as an incisive coda to the book makes clear, are way out of their intellectual depths. Thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, this highly accessible book at the same time makes an important and original contribution to current historiography, particularly on the vexed issue of science and religion. And this, I think, comes directly from its very synoptic nature. So, in fact, the way in which it's a popular, accessible book helps it to have new insights into current historiography. Not only is the much maligned Bishop Ussher treated sympathetically as someone who was very much in the cultural and scientific mainstream of his day, but the kind of scholarly chronology that Ussher practiced, based that it was on Christian scripture, is presented as having a clear intellectual continuity with modern geochronology. So going from the 17th century right to the very present day opens up new intellectual avenues. As such, far from the Bible stymieing the scientific study of the earth, its finite and directional timeline of history actually, in Martin's argument, facilitated it, with long-standing historical approaches to the sacred text being transferred to rocks and fossils, and providing the conceptual breakthrough that gave us the very idea of deep time. So while Earth's deep history is primarily aimed at non-specialists, and it does that job incredibly effectively, it is nonetheless a book that will commend itself to professional historians of science. That combination of popularity, precision, and perspicuity, as many of us here will know well, is a very difficult trick to pull off. Earth's deep history does it with aplomb, and as such, it is a very worthy and deserving winner of the Dingle Prize for 2015, and I'd like to award that prize in the form of a certificate and cheque to Martin now.
Well, thank you, Jamie and Garan, for those very generous words about this book of mine. I must say that I was thrilled to hear that the judges had decided to give my book this wonderful Dingle Prize, which has so many distinguished predecessors as winners of the prize. It was not just a huge personal honour, but also I was thrilled on behalf of the book, because rather as Graham was saying about their book, the book itself has a personality of its own, as it were, and I almost feel sort of detached from it, and I only have a kind of, sort of godfatherly connection with the book itself. So I'm very, very pleased that the book has been awarded this, particularly, of course, that it is the Dingle Prize, because this does mean that you're recognising, my peers, as it were, are recognising what the book was trying to do, the audience that it was, the readership that it was trying to reach in terms of this accessibility. And I want to sort of start by saying I think this whole question of accessibility or popularization and so on is a very contested issue which we need to address a great deal more than we do. This was brought home to me by one of the few reviews that the book has had so far, which was in Nature and was written by an acquaintance, a friend of mine really almost, who's a geologist, who said some very nice things about it. But then he said, but this is not a popular book. I think that's my correct quote. And what he meant by that, it turned out, from what he also wrote, was that there wasn't much human interest in it. And I know when you demythologize what he means by human interest, it meant that there weren't any of the sort of King Alfred's cakes or George Washington cherry tree kind of anecdotes about the historical figures that the book deals with. And I think we have to confront the fact that there are very distinct concepts of what a sort of a book about science, or in this case the history of science, should be like if it's designed for a popular audience, and that there's an awful lot of dumbing down going on, or heroic myth-making, and I've sort of said that there seem to be a lot of popular science writers, and also, unfortunately, scientists who presume to write about the history of their own sciences seem to want to stay within a comfort zone of myth-making about the past. And certainly in the history of the earth sciences, this is acutely the case, with people like Hutton and Lyell being awarded heroic status, or usually, in a very sexist terms, father status, father figures for science. And I think we really should confront that and challenge it. So it seems to me important that our friends, and I have a good many friends on the other side of the channel in French culture currently, do have a concept of haute vulgarisation, which doesn't seem to have any equivalent in British culture, British intellectual culture, the idea of high-level popularization, where you know it's addressing intelligent people. In writing my book, I very consciously had in mind my own friends who are not at all academics, but most of them are much more intelligent than I am, and they're certainly much more widely read than I am. And I wanted to write something that would appeal to them and would engage their intellects, as well as their imagination. And within that range of potential readers, I also had, for me, a very important subset of potential readers, and that is my friends and former colleagues who are scientists. And I do think that we in the history of science and professional history of science don't pay anything like enough attention to the importance of scientists as potential audience for our books. So I tried to do that. So much for the sort of audience. Now, about the historiography, yes, I've tried rather ambitiously to reshape the historiography of my pet subject within the history of science while popularizing it. And this is perhaps very, very conceited to even try this, but I think it's worth trying, because I wanted to outline what seems to me to be a really important major revolution, if we can allowed to use that word, which is, you know, in the same league as the Copernican and the Darwinian and such like revolutions, although it's very much underappreciated by comparison. And it's I haven't really don't make much claim for very original ideas. A lot of what I put into the book is already well known to specialists, but it may not be so widely known to the generality of historians of science, and certainly not to more widely than that. And it's very much underappreciated because and I think it's partly because of a conceptual confusion between time and history. So it's almost always dealt with as being a revolution in ideas about time, that time goes from being relatively brief in ideas of sort of a young Earth to ideas of great deep time. But I think it's much more important to think in terms of deep history, and that's why I put that into the title. In other words, it's not the magnitude of years or millions or billions of years that's most important. It's what is conceived to have happened within that span of time, or those spans of time, in terms of events. In other words, like human history. So one of the main themes of my book is this, that I'm trying to trace the historicization of the natural world, which happened, I believe, historically, in terms of human history. It happened first in the science that came to be called geology. It wasn't called geology at the time. So I think this is what's really important is not the enlargement of the Earth's time scale, but the reconstruction of the Earth's history. And I also argue that this happened by the deliberate and knowing transposition of ideas and concepts from human historiography into the world of nature, which is we now take for granted as something one can do, and there's no sort of great problem about it. But at the time, it was very uncertain. How could you possibly know the history of things that have not been observed by any human beings? Human beings are the observers of history, and they're the recorders of history. So how can you know it? So I treat geology as being the first natural science to treat nature as historical, and of course it's very well known that that was later transposed into biology, with the idea of organisms being historical in their essence, as it were. Especially, of course, that's due to a geologist who was called Charles Darwin. We don't think of him as a geologist, but he was, of course. That's how he made his name. So this historiography involves ignoring the so-called divide between the so-called two cultures. It means acknowledging the sheer diversity of plural sciences, both natural and human, because it looks to the borrowing of human history from human history into the study of nature. It means combating what one of my Dutch colleagues long ago used to refer to rather nicely as the Anglophone heresy of a singular monolithic science with a capital S, which I'm afraid is now embedded in our English language to our great impoverishment. So, my book traces the longue durée of this revolution of the discovery of deep time. I try to overcome my own and other people's period specialization in terms of historical period. I also try to overcome as far as possible the very widespread tendency to be uninational, if that's the right word. And I also, like all my books, I illustrate them densely, I suppose, because that I've always regarded that as obviously necessary with this particular kind of subject matter, perhaps because of my having had a first career as an earth scientist. Now, I want very quickly to go over the substance of the book with some slides from it, just taking you very quickly and inadequately, really, through the main themes of the book. So I have to find how to... No, nothing has happened. It's gone blank. Oh, you've got to do something else first. That. Which one? The digital technology always lets me down. No, that's the end. That's the last. Right. You've given the game away by starting. It's the very right-hand one. Right. There we are. So I take the bull by the horns by starting with the much maligned Archbishop Usher and his 4004 BC, and I rehabilitate him. Not, I'm not the first person to have done this, of course. I originally thought of entitling the book 4004 BC and all that, but my American editor said that the allusion to 1066 would not be understood by anybody outside England, which is probably quite correct, so I changed the title. So I rehabilitate the science of chronology, very much following following amateurishly in the footsteps of my one-time Princeton colleague Tony Grafton, who has made a big thing of the importance of chronology as an early modern science, as a scholarly historical science, as an attempt by scholars to construct an integrated timeline of world history using all sources known to them, secular and sacred. And I point out that the alternative, in the 17th century, the alternative was to this young earth, or short time, was not deep time or deep history, but Aristotelian eternalism, which puts the whole thing into a different perspective. So, I also point out that when half a century after Ussher's death, his dates first get into the margins of a Bible, it is set out quite clearly that these are marginal editorial notes, and nobody should ever have thought that they were part of the sacred text itself, whatever one thinks about the sacred text or whether it's sacred at all. So then I try experimentally to recast the whole business of chronology in a modern visual form. You may think this is gross anachronism. I don't think it is. I think that this shows very clearly what the chronologists thought they were up to. They were plotting a timeline, as I've said, on 3 different timescales that they used, plotting a sequence of distinctive moments in history, which they call epochs, separating a sequence of eras, and you notice where the weight of evidence in Ussher's work lay in the most recent centuries BC, petering out into almost nothing in the more limited, the other earlier periods. And I argue that there's a conceptual continuity between this kind of diagram, which is based on Ussher's figures, and what modern earth scientists do when they do what's called geochronology. It's exactly the same concept of time and history is involved, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So, at the same time, in the 17th century, you've got this non-temporal, non-historical activity of natural history, of course, with the cabinets of curiosities and stones and fossils on shelves are just classified along with a whole variety of other things. And there is in this traditional natural history no sense of nature's history particularly. And the crucial transposition comes with the recognition that at least some of the objects that were called fossils were organic in origin, that they were dramatically different from anything known alive, and that therefore you could apply to them by analogy what historians applied to their material, and that is that you could talk about nature's coins, nature's monuments, nature's antiquities. And these was with a giant ammonite like this came to be regarded as one of nature's antiquities, which you could then use to begin to construct nature's history. And you could see that being done, for example, in Steno's very well-known reconstruction of the physical history of Tuscany, where he operates the same method as the chronologists, where you can read the evidence in 2 ways. You either read it backwards in time in the order of inference, and then, having done that, you can reverse, and only then can you reverse direction and reconstruct things from forwards in time, reconstructed as history. So all that in the 17th century, I argue, this is putting it terribly briefly and oversimply, of course, is that you've got the beginnings of the idea of nature having its own history, but it's nature having a history which is coeval with human history. There's no essential sense of there being deep history, pre-human history. It goes back into the mythical early ages of humankind, of course, but no further. There's no need for anything further. So you've got the crucial conceptual innovation of the historicizing of the natural world taking place before there's any sense of a vast time scale, most of which a vast history, most of which is pre-human. So much for the sort of early period of up to the sort of mid-18th century. Going very, very quickly on to the what I call a sort of middle period, which is the period of the mid-18th to mid-19th centuries, which is the period that I've spent a lot of my time publishing on, and I've published these two monstrously heavy volumes, which jointly come to about 1,200 pages, and I don't know, about 200, at least 200 illustrations, I think. And that is all condensed, you will be glad to know, into less than 100 pages, I think. It's difficult to calculate exactly, in the middle of my new book. So you can read all about it in a very, very simple way. And this seems to me, I spent all my second career studying this period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries because I became convinced at an early stage that this was the most important period in the longue durée of this story of the reconstruction of the Earth's history, because it was crucial for learning how to reconstruct Earth history by applying human history, by applying analogies of human history. So again, we get this taken for granted use of human history metaphors as a routine. Nature's documents, nature's archives, nature's epochs, as, for example, in Desmarais' reconstruction of the history of the extinct volcanoes in Auvergne, just one example out of many. And the point is that this was at the same period in the late 18th century, particularly the study of sequences of rocks, as here in this example, you get the vast time scale is taken for granted. In other words, the time scale is expanded, but what's much more important is that vast amount of time came to be filled with ideas of events and sequences of events, in this case, the accumulation of piles and piles of rocks, accumulating in thousands of feet thick, and many of them very obviously having been deposited very slowly, layer by layer, and so it became really impossible to believe that this could possibly have happened in a short period. And since there were no human fossils, it gradually became clear to naturalists that most of this vast time must have been, vast history must have been before there were any human beings around. So then, in the early 19th century, you get a whole sequence of new ways of treating traditional materials. For example, Cuvier's literally, explicitly resurrecting an extinct mammal from its scattered bones with deliberate echoes of Ezekiel. You get, about the same time, this caricature of Buckland, well known now, time travelling into a Kirkdale cave and finding the extinct hyenas live and well. So it starts as a joke, but a joke with a serious point. Only a few years later, you get from Delaverche's more ancient Dorset reconstructed scene, everything eating something else, great fun, but also, jokey in appearance, but serious and scientific in content, because it was all based on concrete evidence in the fossils. So these examples of this kind show an increasing confidence on the part of the people who now call themselves geologists that it is possible, without being over-speculative, to reconstruct the unobserved pre-human past. And that, I think, is a really important development. And of course, it then becomes appropriated in the service of popular science. And significantly, this very famous example from Mantell, the actual drawing, it was made to his instructions, of course, but by John Martin, who many of you well know was a famous painter of historical scenes. So that you've got, again, this very close connection between the understanding the pre-human geological past history of the Earth and ideas about human history. So now, of course, in this period, the early 19th century, is usually thought as being, this is the age of Lyell, and we've even had some historians of science who ought to have known better, claiming that really geology only started in 1830 when Lyell started publishing the Principles of Geology. Now, I don't want to sort of pull Lyell down, but I've tried to put him into his proper context, being very important in his own way, but mainly because he championed and plugged a method of comparing, using the present as a key to the past, use the phrase that became current later in the 19th century, that he pressed that method to its limits. But in doing so, inadvertently, he showed what the limits were, that not everything can be explained in terms of the past. Not everything in the past can be explained in terms of the present. So that here again is a connection with this is a ruin from Roman times. So it's a bit of human history, and it's being used as to apply and use as an analogy with the longer Earth history. One of the problems that people like Lyell, well, there weren't many people like Lyell. There was only Lyell and perhaps Darwin as his sidekick, but who came to be called uniformitarians. But one of their problems was to explain things like this, which were very striking to most geologists and were taken to be evidence of a catastrophic geological deluge, which was not necessarily identified with Noah's flood. That's another historiographical myth. But it was taken to be strong evidence for something very, very special and unusual and dramatic, which had happened and geologically very recently. And of course, it was eventually reinterpreted as evidence of huge ice sheets during an ice age, which was again a very catastrophic conclusion to come to. But it replaced an equally catastrophist interpretation in terms of a geological deluge. So, at the same time, rushing on very quickly, quite different kind of evidence from the sequence of rock formations and their fossils leads to interpretations of this kind by John Phillips, appropriately William Smith's nephew, and a very fine paleontologist. By 1860, is able to interpret and synthesize the amazing amount of knowledge which came out just in a few decades on the history of life as recorded in the sequence of rock formations, all the way from the apparent origin of life through apparent extinction events to the present. This fluctuating diversity and abundance of life, and above all, an eventful history. That's the crucial point about this kind of thing. Now, in that context, I try to sort of rather marginalize the whole question of evolution, because I think one of the problems about the historiography is that this whole story has been appropriated into being just a sort of a prelude to the much more sexy story of Darwin's evolution. And I've tried to sort of show how much was going on which was not dependent on having a particular theory of the causation of evolution. What mattered much more was the delineation of the sequence of events in the history of life. So here's an example from Agassiz, who is well known to have been a great opponent of Darwin in terms of evolutionary theory, but he's producing a wonderful diagram which is amazingly modern in appearance, and he called it the genealogy of the class of fishes. And yet he was strongly opposed to the idea of evolution. But you've got a wonderful bit of history of life, or history of fish life, there in that diagram. And some had a technical problem at the last moment before leaving home, and I should have had a picture of one of the earliest human fossils to make the point, and somehow it didn't come through. But this is also the same period which we've been hearing about in one of the sessions earlier today, about the very reluctant acceptance that there were human fossils, although it didn't really upset things that much, because the human fossils were only found in the most recent deposits, and it was clearly from very, very recent in terms of geological history, the history of the Earth. But as usual, I think what's important is that the debates were primarily about the historical reality of things, rather than always taking the precedence over questions of the cause in terms of evolution. Now, quickly, finally going on to the third and last period, what I call sort of my late period, from the late 19th century to the present day. And the history here was pretty much new to me. I had to do a lot of primary research because there's, well, not very much history has been written. Not much that I think is really very good, but I did have to rely mostly on secondary sources, much of it written by geologists, some of it, I have to say, historiographically rather naive, but some of it is extremely good. But I really did rather enjoy being able to see how my own very, very minor participation in these debates back in the 1960s in my first career came into the big picture. Particularly, I'm very proud to have been a very minor participant in the first putting forward the idea of having been a dramatic snowball Earth episode in the very distant past history of the Earth. Which has been one of the big things about 20th century discoveries of the history of the Earth, which of course has been enormously affected by the development of radiometric dating. But radiometric dating again there's such an obsession with quantitativeness in the history of science, particularly among scientists, that they don't notice that what happened in the well-known story of how Kelvin's sort of few dozen millions of years for the whole history of the Earth was blown apart by the discovery of radioactivity, and led directly to present estimates of a few millions of years for the total history. What matters, I think, much more is what was put into this vastly increased amount of time. And what happened, I think, really importantly, is that instead of the fossil record I showed you in that Phillips diagram of the fluctuating curve of life's diversity and abundance, where you had the assumed beginning of life, that at the bottom in the Cambrian. Before that, the tacit assumption among geologists at the end of the 19th century was that would only be preceded by a relatively short sort of prologue, as it were, before life got going, and life of quite complex kinds got going. But after the beginnings of radiometric dating, what I think really mattered was that this completely reversed the whole fossil record. Instead of being sort of everything except the first chapter, became just the last chapter. And all the other chapters had no proper fossil record. And this is a real problem, because in the first fossils were these pretty complex creatures like trilobites and so on. That was a real problem in the 20th century. And only gradually, in the later 20th century, were the evidence accumulate, various kinds, of which this is just one, that life had a very long fossil record, which had not really been properly recognized previously, but it was all microscopic. A lot of it prokaryotic, and even the eukaryotes having been relatively late in formation. So this completely changed the character of the fossil record in a quite unexpected way. And simultaneously, we had, of course, the rather well-known story of continental drift leading to plate tectonics and so on. And I think historically the really important thing about this is how grudging was the acceptance of mobile continents, both by the Americans and by the Soviet Russians, compared to the Europeans. And I think that, there's a big sort of story of cultural history of science that has not been fully explored yet. I mean, Naomi Oreskes has made a wonderful start in it, a wonderful book on the rejection of continental drift. But I think there's a lot more to be said about that. So that here you've got somebody, a very important South African geologist, putting forward very good arguments for the reality of continental drift. And a lot of the grudging, the reluctance to accept the reality of it was because of this conceptual confusion between causation and historicity. And because a lot of the scientists concerned were not prepared to accept the possible historical reality of mobile continents because there was no adequate cause, physical cause for it. And there were adequate physical causes, so the reason why it wasn't accepted is still quite unclear. Likewise, with the possibility of impacts from outer space as being an important element in the history of the Earth. Again, there was very late and very grudging acceptance, particularly by the Americans. I'm not being anti-American, I've lived there happily and for many years, but it does seem very striking fact about the history of this kind of science that the Americans were particularly grudging in their and reluctant to accept the reality of past catastrophes and mass extinctions and such like exciting events in the deep history of the Earth. And so finally, the cosmic perspective, again, very important, I think, in changing the perspective of geologists towards the history of the Earth, so that Earth history itself became just one example of a larger class of narratives which are planetary histories and leading to sort of conditions of discussion of conditions of life on exoplanets and so on. So finally we get a sort of a synthesis of all this, which I think was rather nice, came out in The Economist just a few years ago, showing the current or very recent interpretation of the history of the planet. And this, I think, is important because it does put the quantitative scale of the Earth's time into a context of making sense of its amazingly eventful and varied and unpredictable history, and unpredictable in several senses, but unpredictable certainly to those who are trying to discover it. So, just to conclude, I think that this discovery of a very eventful planetary history for the Earth is quite as important culturally as well as sort of more narrowly scientifically as the idea of human beings having only appeared at the relatively last moment. I think the point about the historicity of nature is a really important thing, and also that it has been radically contingent, both in discovery and in the Earth's own history. So to come to the second half of my subtitle, Why It Matters, I think I've probably rather shortchanged my readers on that, but I'm not an expert, and I really was aware of I really wanted to leave my readers to decide for themselves on why the story of the discovery of the Earth's history is also important for current questions about climate change, unrenewable resources, the future of the planet as an abode for human beings, etc., etc. Finally, really finally, as Gowan had mentioned, I relegate young Earth creationism deliberately to an appendix, because I didn't want it to treat it as I was intending to do at one point as the last section of the last chapter, because then that would make it look as though that's the culmination of the whole story. I wanted to make it clear that it is not the culmination of the story, that it is very strange, that it is essentially an culturally American phenomenon, which is only very recently expanded with American money to the rest of the world. And that it is that the creationists, unlike Archbishop Usher and others back in the 17th century, are out on a limb, and a very precarious one at that. They are not in really it is epistemologically directly analogous to flat earthism, in the sense that it completely ignores the sheer weight of evidence that doesn't go in its own favour. So I mean, I was worried that the book, one of the very few reviews the book's had so far in the TLS by a good friend of mine, good geologist called Claudio Vitafinzi, spent most of the time, most of his review. He said some nice things about the book. That's not the point. But he spent most of his review on a great tirade, a justified tirade against young Earth creationism. And that's not the point of the book. And that disappointed me very much. So very much as a side issue, yes, I tried to debunk the old myth of geology versus Genesis as being one example of science versus religion. I think in this sort of environment here, you all know that the conflict thesis is a dead horse that's certainly not worth flogging, but it still goes on being flogged. So, to finish off, I still think that much work needs to be done in getting the history of science to the intelligent reading public. And I think it's worth trying a lot more haute vulgarisation to replace the dumbing down myth-making, which I'm afraid all, our popular science books and history of science books and history of science television programs go in for so much. I just groan and my heart sinks when the history of geology comes up in one of these television programs. And I think, oh yes, here we go again. I hope that many of you will think seriously about applying your own expertise in some branch of the history of science, technology and medicine to trying to write for this intelligent general public, because I think it really is something that we need to do for its own sake and also for our own public relations, and it hasn't been done anything like enough so far. I've just had my shot at it, which I'm well aware of is far from perfect, but at least I've tried, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, what a wonderfully rich and incredibly wide-ranging lecture that was, which reflects so wonderfully well on the book, which embodies all of those qualities itself. We don't have time for questions because Adam is lurking just over to my left, trying to move you on to drinks or something like that. But I'm sure that Martin's lecture has stimulated a great many points of question and discussion, particularly on the importance of communicating